In this third lecture from Module 2, I wanted to contrast what we've been talking about, the multinational, multilateral approach, with a more regional approach to economic cooperation. And so as we talked about, since World War II, there's been two different tracks, the multilateral that we discussed last time and the more regional. And again, the distinguishing features between the multilateral and the regional is usually a smaller amount of countries, so it's not global in nature, and it's got a regional focus, and there's a whole range of regional types of agreements and integration that we'll talk about. And so, as I said, it's the regional approach rather than the global, and so a lot of the agreements they're amongst the Asian countries or the African countries. In North America, we have NAFTA. There's the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we mentioned briefly before. So it's a smaller number of countries, regional in nature. Sometimes they're limited to just certain products or economic sectors. So in a partial free trade area, for example, oftentimes limited to just a few goods that the countries have agreed to lower trade barriers as opposed to everything that they trade. And in these, there's not a system for dispute resolution like there is in the World Trade Organization. A lot of this is just based on negotiations and realization of shared mutual interests that countries agree to. Yes, let's free up trade, lower trade barriers, and that will benefit each of us. And so that's the reason that the agreements start in the first place and last. And so what these negotiations result in is some form of regional trading arrangement, agreements, different levels of economic integration. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. And so regional trading arrangements, so there's a relatively small group of countries and then different levels of economic integration, primarily focused on lowering trade barriers, tariffs and non-tariff both. And so a couple of examples that we've mentioned before that we'll look at this time is the European Union and NAFTA. So free trade agreements in the Western Hemisphere. So here's the regional trade agreements that the U.S. and its neighbors are. And so the book talks about this one, the Mercosur, and then there's the CAFTA, and NAFTA has been huge for us. So here's a list of the ones that are in the Western Hemisphere. Other ones that are important in terms of South America and the Caribbean are these. So here's the map. In Africa and Asia, here's a list of some of the more important ones that are in the book. Asia, here's this. So we'll talk about we'll look at ASEAN and APEC, both important. So these are free trade areas. And note here, we have free trade areas versus common markets. We're going to explain the difference between these types of economic organizations here in a minute. So here's some ones in Africa. So a little map of the ones that are mentioned in the book. And then the APEC countries are here. ASEAN, very important. Here's a map of that one. And then we'll talk about, we'll go into, so these are all agreements that involve Europe. And so we'll look at the evolution of these over time. And so there's a range of free trade arrangements, agreements, and levels of economic integration. So they range from a limited number of goods. We're going to lower tariffs on a few goods between a couple of countries, to full-blown economic unity like we see in the European Union. So there's a range of them. So let's look at the different possibilities and how countries have agreed to integrate and cooperate with each other. So we're talking about different degrees of economic integration, and so we're lowering trade restrictions. That's one, and then factor mobility. So are we going to allow our workers to move between member countries? How are we going to let capital flow between different countries? Are we going to use the same currency? And so there's a whole spectrum of types of economic integration that we've seen. And so let's just look. So here's the table that's in your book. So we have at the lowest level, I guess, is a partial trade agreement. So it's just basically we're going to eliminate trade barriers on a relatively few items between a relatively few number of countries. A free trade agreement is we're going to eliminate trade barriers between goods and services flowing between member countries. Customs union, common market, economic union. So there's the ones that are in the book, and I take a little bit of exception. So it's a common market, so it has all the features of a common market, plus it says here substantial harmonization of economic policies. Yes, and there's a lot of economists, as we'll soon see, distinguish between an economic union, which has all of these, and a monetary union, which then incorporates a common currency. So as we'll see in the EU, there are members of the European Union so they're part of the economic union, but they have not yet adopted the euro, so it's not a full monetary union. So here's the hierarchy, if you will. So oftentimes we'll start off with a free trade area that will lead to a customs union, a common market, an economic union, and then finally a monetary union. So as we'll see, the European Union has gone through all of these stages, so it's a nice example. And so the partial trade agreement, as we said, is just a couple of countries agreeing to remove trade barriers on a few products. A free trade area is we're going to eliminate trade restrictions, tariffs, etc., on all goods and services between member countries. However, each member country, so between our members, between the members of our of NAFTA, for example, we're not going to have any tariffs, quotas, or non-tariff barriers on goods and services that we trade with each other. However, each country is free to maintain whatever set of tariffs, quotas, other trade barriers that they want to with countries that are outside of our agreement. A common union has everything that a free trade area does, plus a common external tariff. So we're going to remove all of our trade barriers between ourselves, and we're going to adopt a common stance with regard to the types of trade restrictions that we're going to have with other countries. A common market is everything in a customs union. So again, no trade barriers amongst us. We will have a common set of policies towards non-member countries, plus we're going to allow labor and capital to move freely within member countries. So again, it's free movement of goods and services amongst ourselves. We're all going to have the same trade policies, tariffs, etc. towards other countries that are not in our agreement, and we're going to allow labor and capital to move freely within our borders. Finally, an economic union has everything that a common market does, plus we have coordinated macroeconomic policies. So sometimes this will involve a common currency, but we're going to try to coordinate our policies so that our inflation rates and our government budget deficits, our interest rates are all coordinated and in harmony with each other. So again, here's the feature. So no trade barriers amongst us, common trade policies with outsiders, free mobility, plus we're going to coordinate our monetary and fiscal policies, our taxation, our social welfare programs, and they will be administered by a supranational institution that will take on the responsibility for coordinating. So each country, to some extent, loses its independent monetary, fiscal, and other policies. And then finally, the book doesn't make the distinction, but there is a distinction between an economic union. So we have everything that we just talked about, and a monetary union. So it's everything that's in an economic union, plus we're going to adopt a common currency. So, for example, like I just said earlier, the European Union, there are countries that have the euro as a common currency, but there are also members of the European Union that don't. So it's an economic union and a partial monetary union. And that's the end of this one. And so let's look a little more closely at the EU.